today, John invited me to talk about meadow restoration and the program that Institute for Bird Populations has working with meadow restoration and birds. And he also encouraged me to add a little bit of information on the work that we've been doing in recent years with bumblebees as well. So I'm going to try to hit a lot of topics today, and so it's going to be a little bit cursory for some of this, but I'm happy to take questions. And if there's something I leave out because I'm just running through everything, then please let me know and I'll come back to it. So I think the first thing, let's see, and I changed up the way my computer is set up, so I apologize. Last minute changes might make this a little bit awkward at times. Okay, so why meadows? Why am I talking to you about meadows? Why do we care about meadows? We have a lot of different things happening in the Western US, and meadows are just one of them. So for our work in the Sierra Nevada, we really think about meadows a lot because even though they're really very small, less than 4% of the Sierran landscape, they really have an outsized importance for many species of bird and other taxa in the Sierra. They're obviously important for those riparian obligate species, but many other species also use these as important sources of food for feeding fledglings or nestlings. They're really important sites for fall migration stopover. And so there's really a lot going on at these sites, even for species we don't think of as meadow or riparian. In general, too, meadow health in the Sierra Nevada and elsewhere in the West has really declined, as European influence, came into these sites, and especially with the gold rush in California, the hydrology in most of these meadows has really been affected, and we see a lot of things like incised channels, so where you have a floodplain and then a really steep-sided creek with the water down at the very bottom. And associated with that then is vegetation loss. And then of course, climate change is something that we think about too with meadow health, because less snowpack in the winter, means that there's often less water to feed these montane meadows. Also of interest recently is hydrologic restoration. It's something that has really increased in the last decade. I'm involved with, there's a large group of us from many different organizations called the Sierra Meadows Partnership. I encourage you to check it out at sierrameadows.org. From the dozer operators for restoration to the ornithologists to the hydrologists, it's a vast group, as well as agencies as well, that we're trying to look at meadow restoration and do it wisely and try to move it forward. And part of that's also related to, in 2010, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation started a Sierra Meadows funding source, which is now, SNEST, but it's something that really got this going. Collectively, there's actually been quite a bit of effort, both in restoration, but also in monitoring effects of it. So that's one of the reasons that I want to talk about meadows. And then just to set the stage for the rest of what I'm going to talk about is what are the benefits of meadows that are intact or that have a restored hydrology versus those that are degraded. And I think this image kind of can really, that's at the top of the screen, can explain part of that. These meadows that have intact hydrology act as giant sponges. They hold the water and they release it really slowly over the course of the whole summer, so that you're still getting water releases downstream during the hottest time of year. So not only in the meadows, but downstream, water users, both wildlife and human, are getting a benefit from that. These meadows that have intact hydrology have these regular overbank floods on every few years. You get flooding up over the bank and into the herbaceous vegetation. And that creates this disturbance that is necessary for a lot of seeds to germinate. It also deposits the seeds. So things like willow really need that kind of flooding event to both create situations where germination can occur and provide the water at the root level, so that once they've germinated, they can be recruited into the mature age classes. And so also these kind of systems, like I say, support lots of age classes of willow and other riparian shrub. And I'm going to use the word willow a lot today, but and while willow is probably one of our most abundant riparian shrubs, I kind of use it interchangeably with riparian deciduous shrubs, things like alder or red twig dogwood. There's a lot of them out there. It's just easier to These flooded areas also deter some mammalian nest predators that come in from the edges. Well, obviously there's always been mammalian nest predators, but we have seen that in some of these dried out meadows, you see a lot more edge predators making it out to the center of the meadow. And then The shallow wetlands and seasonally flooded areas with emergent vegetation provide this breeding ground and create really abundant and diverse insect prey for the birds in these meadows. And I think what's maybe even more important is that they have with a lot of water and different kinds of pools and standing and moving water, you have these varied periods of emergence so that you're getting flushes of insects throughout the whole breeding season. And then to sort of pollinators, I'm going to talk about towards the end, just these same things. As you look at that photo, you see these complex, hydrology where the water is flowed out into old oxbows and old stream channels. Those things dry down at different rates over the course of the summer. And so you have, even the same plant species might occur across the whole area. Some of it's going to bloom earlier as it dries, but the stuff in the wetter parts of the meadow might bloom later in the summer. So you're extending that bloom period, which is pretty important. Okay, so now on to the sort of four, I'm going to give you brief, somewhat brief synopsis of 4 different projects that we've been working on. Bird response to meadow restoration, sort of specifically this pond and plug type of restoration, willow flycatcher and beaver associations. I'm going to talk about a project where we looked at willow flycatcher response to a specific restoration project. And then to jump into the bumblebee part of it, looking at how bumblebee and bird habitat use kind of interacted in this post-fire riparian area, as well as some of the habitat choices that bumblebees were making. And this image of California is really just showing you the yellow dots are where we've been working recently with, there we go. I assume you guys can see my cursor, but the yellow dots are where we've been doing bumblebee work. The blue dots are where we've had in recent years willow flycatcher surveys, so broadcast surveys. And then the pink dots are areas where we've been working with meadow restoration, basically baseline monitoring for meadow restoration. So some of those are sites that have been restored or will be restored. And then also we try to establish control sites, compare for all of our restoration projects. So that's what those pink dots are showing. For this project that I want to talk about, this was a project that was a National Fish and Wildlife Foundation Desert Terminal Lakes funded project that we did in partnership with Point Blue and my co-authors, Brent Campos and D.Burnett there at Point Blue. We both work in the same area of monitoring bird response in meadows to restoration. And so we really feel like it's important that we collaborate so that we can, bring the most bang for the buck and really have the sample sizes needed to start to answer some of the questions here. This project was one that in time we're hoping will be a before-after control impact design, where we were collecting baseline and post-restoration data on bird abundance for both restored and control sites. But we felt like it was too important to sit on the data we did have, to wait until we had really good sample sizes for a full before-after control impact study. So a couple years ago, we decided that we would take on some of this now, just as an initial part of the project, and look at just time series data, and look at how bird abundance responded to time since restoration, and also look at some of the other physical and biological conditions at these sites pre-restoration, to sort of see if there's a relationship there, because you can imagine that you might have a site that's in pretty good condition prior to restoration. You may not see as steep of an improvement maybe in bird abundance when it was already in pretty good shape, versus a restoration site that was maybe just a very incised sagebrush, flat, where 10 years later after restoration, you might see very different results. So we did try to take some of that into account. These are 32 meadow restoration sites, mostly in the Northern Sierra or Southern Cascades. And they've been restored, the first one in 1999 through 2015. Of course, there's been more since then, but that's just what this project covered. Over 1,000, almost 1,500 point count visits during that time, between 2003 and 2017. And for all of these, we had post-restoration data, either from 1 year up to 18 years after restoration. And so, not for every one of these sites, but for different ones, we had more or less, but at least two. I think we had at least, let me see if I have that in my notes. Yeah, so I'm not exactly sure how, I can't break it down for how many sites had how many visits exactly, but so this is kind of your basic where they were. And the variables we looked at in this were that time since restoration. Obviously, we had pre-restoration shrub cover that we got through aerial photo imagery. It's something that's been, really great now with the NAIP imagery that's readily available. We were able to look at what all of these sites looked like prior to restoration, even if we didn't have baseline for some of these first restoration projects that happened. We looked at some of these stream flow data, so we can kind of get a sense for how much overbank flooding was occurring at these sites. Average summer temperatures, precipitation upstream coming from the California Basin Characterization Model, and then the post-restoration shrubs, which basically came from when we did our point counts out there. We were also collecting vegetation data at every location on every visit. And so for this project, we looked at sort of a real basic set of focal species that we felt like had a really strong association with meadows and would improve with meadow restoration. And that we could easily or appropriately survey using this point count method. And so these are our friends here. As you can see from this slide, the big winners in terms of what we found a lot of were song sparrow and yellow warbler, but we did have good samples of many of the other ones. Swing thrush, not so much, but everything else had at least 30 individuals detected. Let's see. Oh, I just wanted to say, yeah, that in terms of how many times we surveyed these sites, we did try to get sites really had either from 2 to 17 surveys for sites. So some of them we really did have a lot of visits to, and some not. Some of them were just 1 year after restoration. Some of them as much as 9 years after restoration. But really, like I said, what we're hoping for and waiting for is that we need to be able to work on this until we get further out than 9 years, because some things take a long time to develop in terms of how. So just first to look at some of the things like just how did these different species respond to just the conditions that were at the site even prior to restoration? Did we see restoration? Did we see something there? And so we did have a strong result when we just looked at what was the site like before, how much shrub cover did it have? That's what the RDS stands for, riparian deciduous shrub. And we did have, it was an important characteristic for 10 of these species, or 11 species. 9 of them were had a strong improvement with more shrub cover, and one of them less, which was Wilson snipe, which isn't super surprising since it's really more of a emergent wetland, kind of open meadow type of species. When we looked only at time since restoration, we saw that some of these, it wasn't a very strong response. Most of them were positive, but for 5 of these, let's see, it was, let me make sure I'm the right ones. We had black-headed grosbeak, red-breasted sapsucker, song sparrow, warbling vireo, Wilson's warbler, and yellow warbler all had a strong positive effect for time since restoration. So that we really did see a measurable impact of that restoration event on increased abundance for those species. And so I feel like that's an important thing, because we talk a lot about restoration being valuable for birds, but being able to really show it is something that's important. For some of these other species, that I showed you, the sample sizes weren't great. We're hoping that with time we'll get a better reading on how they are affected. And obviously they each have different habitat requirements. So some of these things, it's not surprising that not everybody responds the same way. So basically, in summary for this one, we did see a positive signature there that birds, for many of these species, they did respond positively to changes in just hydrology alone. But we also saw, because they have such a strong association with that vegetation component, that we really recommend that restoration projects look beyond just the what's happening with hydrology, which is typically more of what happens. It's a very expensive process. It's usually something that try to get the hydrology in place and hope that after that, if you build it, the plants will come. And that is true, but we feel like, especially for at-risk species of birds, doing something going beyond that and planting or enhancing vegetation and making that part of the process of restoration can really be valuable. And then I didn't mention this, sorry, I kind of skipped over it, but the rainfall, temperature, and stream flow patterns also did have noticeable impacts for some of these species that we looked at. And so while some of those things aren't maybe something that we have a lot of control over, we can utilize that information if we're making decisions, say, on which site within a certain watershed would be a high potential for restoration, is understanding how some of the things like rainfall in the basin upstream could affect their response to restoration. Okay, guys, one down. We're going to talk about beavers now and willow flycatchers, my favorites. So actually, it was part of the same National Fish and Wildlife Foundation Desert Terminal Lakes project. We worked with partners, Point Blue and Institute for Bird Populations, also worked with Utah State University in Logan, Joe Wheaton's lab, who does a lot of work with this program called Beaver Restoration Assessment Tool, which is really trying to understand how beaver can be basically used as a restoration tool across the Western landscapes to do a lot of the things that we currently do with backhoes or other things when we're looking at restoration projects, and just also highlighting the value of beaver as part of these landscapes and how important they are as engineers within these landscapes. We also worked on that project with the Occidental Arts and Ecology Center, who also do a lot of work with trying to find non-lethal solutions for conflicts with beaver, because there are definitely places where beaver and humans have conflict. So let's see, it's really part of why we got involved with this from the bird standpoint is it's something that in working in meadows in the Sierra, you just notice that there's an association between where you have a lot of beaver and a stream system, you tend to have really great bird response to that, but was something that was mostly anecdotal for the Sierra at this point. And so we wanted to try to take it a little bit further and have some better data to present back on this. And so, like I say, we already observed that beaver are often associated with willow flycatcher and create that flooded area and lots of willow stands. We also, this is a project that Point Blue was working on in Last Chance Creek, the image here at the bottom. This was an area where they were mapping out territories for song sparrow. They observed that there was a flood event, I think it was 2016 or 17, and all the beaver dams below, downstream to the right of this red line, were washed out. And the next season, the beaver only maintained the area upstream of the line, and the song sparrow density upstream of where the beaver were working was 3 times that of the area below. And the year prior to this, before the flooding, really kind of even density across that whole area. And so we're we were seeing this, we wanted to take it another step. So for this study, we used the early stages of the BRAT model, the Beaver Restoration Assessment Tool models, which this Joe Wheaton's lab basically is using readily available Landsat imagery and geomorphological data that's out there to identify and categorize every stream. And they've completed this for, I think, all of California now, at least all of the Sierra, and it is something that's available online now to really anybody who wants to look at it. But identifying stream reaches that have the capacity to support beaver dams and the capacity to support a lot of beaver dams. But even if you're in an area where there's not beaver, that can be useful from understanding where restoration, especially for meadows, can be really successful. So we use that BRAT model to identify 200, randomly basically select 200-meter stream reaches. So we chopped up everything into 200-meter reaches and wanted to compare those that had willow flycatchers and those that didn't. And we only looked at stream reaches that ranked out fairly high on this BRAT model in terms of the ability to support beaver, so that we could really look at that beaver component and see how it might be affecting willow flycatchers. I think that was what I wanted to say about that. Okay, so this is the kind of an example. These red polygons are basically these are 200-meter stream reaches buffered 50 meters on either side. So they're just a polygon area that if one of these was randomly selected for our sample, we went out, we searched that entire polygon looking for beaver dams. If we found them, we GPS the location and recorded information about the size of the dam, the depth of the dam, some other variables associated with it. And then within each of those polygons, we had you'll see there's 5 releve areas, these circles where we collected additional water and vegetation data that was on the site. That was it. Let's see, I think that's what I want to say. So the first step in looking at this was to see, well, did we see anything different between the sites that were occupied by willow flycatcher versus the ones that weren't? And we did. We saw, and it wasn't super surprising, but it's nice to see it pan out and show up here that that sites that were occupied by willow flycatchers were 2.3 times, they had 2.3 times more on average water and saturated soil cover, and about the same in terms of the amount more willow cover than the unoccupied areas did. And then when it comes to looking at actual effects of beaver there, we saw that, and this was using a logistic regression, oh boy, what was it? Resource selection model, I believe, resource selection model. We found that willow flycatchers were twice as likely to occupy a stream reach when it had 3 or more dams per hectare. So in this case, those beaver dams are sort of acting as a proxy for beaver activity. So sites with more beaver activity were much more likely to be occupied by willow flycatchers. And that, I mean, I think I wish to back up a little bit. It's not just that the sites, you know, were say like low velocity, you know, flatter areas of stream, but beforehand we were comparing it. We only compared it against sites that already had a lot of those willow flycatcher components there. They had to have willow present for us to include them in the unoccupied set. So we really are comparing these very similar sites, and that beaver dam and beaver activity really was a strong signature for willow flycatcher occupancy when other things were equal. So yeah, the answer to our question is that beavers do matter for willow flycatchers and other montane meadow songbirds and riparian songbirds. They're maintaining that surface water and wetter soils. So even in systems that have been degraded over time by, you know, human-related activities or natural flash flooding events, they're maintaining those systems by actively damming them. And that is encouraging those plant communities that we want to see. It's encouraging those very insect communities we want to see. And we think it's creating conditions that are discouraging some of those nest predators. Okay, so I want to move, that's kind of a good transition into this other project that we're just wrapping up right now. It's in review at this time, is we wanted to really look kind of at a case study of restoration and willow flycatchers. And we did that in this, the area in Truckee where John got his start looking at willow flycatchers, John Harris, and where I got my master's degree looking at willow flycatchers, and a lot of other people have as well. We wanted to take an opportunity to look at this area because we had, from 1997 through 2010, the Forest Service funded a demography study of willow flycatchers in this area along the Little Truckee River and nearby drainages. And so we had this great baseline of data in there. And so what we did with this project, or with this, what I'm going to present today, is a before-after control impact study design, where we looked at how 2 meadows that were restored, one in the fall of 2009 and one in the fall of 2010, responded to pond and plug restoration, and compared that to the willow flycatchers at 9 meadows that basically acted as controls where restoration hadn't occurred. So 13 years of pre-restoration data on territory numbers, territory density for willow flycatchers, and 9 years of post-restoration data. Now, some constraints on this is that willow flycatchers are already a small population here. We've already documented during that initial demography study that they're declining. And so trying to tease out a restoration effect on a small declining population is not something that is super easy. And then we also had imperfect survey coverage. This demography study ended at the time that restoration occurred. So all the survey work post-restoration, we didn't have this level of intensity of territory and nest monitoring, but we did have good survey data with some standardized territory mapping on most years at most sites. This is just a map showing you that area. The 2 circles in black are the restored sites, Upper and Middle Parazo Meadows. Subsequent to this project, to the work that I'm presenting here, actually the lower Parazo Meadow now has been restored as well. But that information is not included in here. And then let's see, did I mention, oh, so I mentioned we use basic standard broadcasting surveys, that the same method is in place across all the years of this project. So what did we see? We saw that territories have continued to decline. This is, you can see my cursor here, 2010 is when restoration occurred, right around here, 2009 and 10. For this particular just linear regression, we actually limited it to the study sites and the years that had really the best, most complete data. And so you see kind of a gap in there from like 2009 through 13. It doesn't mean we didn't have surveys in there, we actually do, and that's included in some of the later analyses, but for just at a linear regression, we wanted to have very complete data for all the sites we're looking at. This, of course, is on par with what we saw with the demography study, the same kind of declines basically occurring afterwards. So that's not great news. I'm not happy to report that, but there you go. But what we did see, which is really promising, is that we did see using a general linear mix model on this to look at that before after control impact. We actually saw that restored meadows had a significant less of a decline than we saw in the unrestored meadows. And so, while it'd be nice to have, to have restoration occur and see this miraculous improvement across the board, it's still really encouraging to see a positive response like that at these restored sites. It does give me some hope, I have to say. So, kind of wrap that up, yeah, they're declining. They're still declining. We still need to do more. But restored sites did see a smaller decline than unrestored sites. And that's suggesting that this hydrologic restoration is buffering some other negative conditions, negative things that are occurring for the species, either on the breeding grounds or migration, wintering grounds somewhere. But we think that we're seeing a signature of that, and that's very promising. Also, one thing we noted is that restoration did not result in birds leaving the sites that were restored because of the disturbance of restoration. They were still there. Some of those same territories that were occupied year in and year out, obviously with turnover of individuals, those sites, those territory locations remained occupied. We also saw areas in these meadows that were very dry prior to restoration that became re-wetted as a result of restoration, that became colonized by willow flycatchers. So it's also promising that we saw those sorts of effects. And then kind of to flog a dead horse here, but we think that these wetter sites post-restoration are reducing mammalian predation. They're increasing the availability of prey. And with those two things together, we did see from the more limited territory monitoring that we did do, that it seemed like we had a lot of nest success early in the season, during first nest attempts. And if that's in fact true, that means that the individuals, if they're not having to re-nest repeatedly throughout the course of the whole summer, they're going to have more time to put on fat prior to migration. The young are going to have more time to just become older, more experienced prior to migration. All these things could really be benefiting overall survival for this species. And finally, last but not least, I want to jump in a little bit and sort of bring some of the bumblebee work into what I was talking about today. And so this is a project looking at bird and bumblebee response or use of riparian habitat up in the Moonlight Fire in Northern California. And so what we wanted to do here was collect baseline riparian bird and bumblebee data within the Moonlight Fire footprint, looking both at presence and relative abundance, and habitat requirements for riparian birds and bees, and how those habitat requirements might intersect. And then secondarily, and it's actually a separate paper, but I'm going to kind of shove it in here with the rest of this stuff, was identification of important floral resources for bumblebees. So this is that Moonlight Fire area, which sadly, I think a lot of this has burned again in the Dixie Fire in the last weeks. But this burned, when we did this project, it had already been more than 10 years since it had burned. So it wasn't a sort of scorched earth type of landscape. It was one where in these riparian zones, there was a lot of riparian recovery happening. So it was actually quite interesting to look at how those sites were being used. We had 204 point counts and 413 bumblebee plots. For the first part of the stuff I'm going to tell you about, these were we only looked at the locations where we had co-located bumblebee and bird point counts. And then we used the grit sampling scheme on this. For the focal bird species, there are 22 riparian associates, so it's not as pared down as, say, the meadow focal species I was showing you earlier. This is really more, it could include any species that is known to come to their highest densities in riparian zones, even if they actually use a rather broad variety of habitats. The most common of these that we had were the McGillivray's warbler, house wren, western wood pewee, and warbling vireo. So kind of a mix of what we think of as more very much riparian versus species that also occur elsewhere, but are quite abundant in riparian zones. Standard point counts were used for this work. And for bumblebees, we used 20-meter circular plots, like I said, co-located with the point counts for birds. Using a insect collection net, we would capture and chill all the bumblebees on the site, in the plot within a 16-minute active search. And then after they'd been chilled, we would photograph and identify and release the bumblebees. At the site, we recorded the plant that they were foraging on when we captured them, as well as all the plants that were blooming basically on that plot during the time of the survey. And for that bee communities, we ended up with 13 species that we identified, 5 of them that we really used for the analysis that I'm going to show you, basically because we had the abundance that we needed to be able to say something about it. It was almost 5,000 captures over those 2 years. And one thing that's very interesting, and we've seen this across a lot of our other bumblebee projects as well, is that, this is something sort of different from typically what we see with birds, is that we could have just massive differences from year to year in abundance of individual species. The slide picture A and B in this figure, in the second year of the project, we had 12 times more Bombus bosnisinskii than we did in the first year, even though the numbers stayed relatively the same for the other species. So if you're looking at the y-axis, you can see that they're not the same. And so, and then also just phenology was similar between the 2 years, though. So for this community occupancy response, community response occupancy model, we kind of found that there wasn't actually a lot of overlap in terms of how birds and bumblebees responded. So this vertical gray line, if you're to the left of that line, it's a negative response or effect on likelihood of occupancy. To the right of that line is a positive response on the likelihood of occupancy. The yellow stars are significant responses. For birds, the black stars are significant responses for bumblebees. But really, birds preferred areas with not very much overstory cover, and they preferred areas, or so much preferred, but were more likely to occupy areas with more willow cover. Also saw some similar things with the cover from whitethorn and from tobacco brush, but not significantly so. Whereas for bumblebees, shrub cover, not so much. They did not enjoy that. They really were looking for places with a lot of floral diversity. So basically the number of different flowering plants that we recorded over the course of the season at an individual plot. And then elevation had a positive effect on bumblebees as well. And at first, looking at this model, we tried to think about how to interpret it in terms of finding some sweet spot that, they're just the right amount of willow cover that made the birds happy and made the bumblebees happy. And you can kind of get there, but ultimately, we realized really it's more about, it's telling us that, heterogeneity is very important in these systems, and that if you were to think about this from a standpoint of like restoring riparian zones, you're just not going to please everything in one little spot, but making sure that you're really providing for these different habitat components over the course of a stream reach or stream system. Okay, now this one's complicated, people. This is that floral response or floral use by bumblebees. And this is what we got from those measurements of what the bees were using and what was available on the plot of the day, on the day of the visit. And what we came up with were 14 plant species that, so along this y-axis right here are the plant species that were used more frequently than you would expect based on just their availability alone. So species that the bumblebees were really selecting for. These are the 5 bee species that we were looking at here. And then for both of those parts of the graph, this is day of the year along the bottom. So if we're looking up here at bumblebees, we see that Bombus melanopigus was most abundant early in the season and then tapered off. Species like Bombus bifarius was not very common. Actually, that species had a name change. I haven't fixed the slide, apologies. And then became more abundant later in the season. Same thing if we look at the slide for in terms of when these plants were most abundant. Some of these, like this long stalk clover and bluebells, as well as the phacelias were more abundant in terms of blooms early in the season, while some of our Canada thistle, which is an invasive, fireweed, and this aster were more abundant in terms of blooming late in the summer, which is not surprising. Plants have different phenologies. But what's interesting here is when we start to look at how these things meet together. So the size of the circle over here has to do with the how much that individual bumblebee species selected a given plant. How much did they selected over and beyond how it was available. And so we see some definite preferences. Part of it has to do with just the time of year that the bees are out and what's blooming, obviously. But we did see some really interesting things where certain plants, maybe the selection isn't super strong, although again, every one of these plants was being selected at a rate greater than expected based on availability. But this Monardella odoris, this is the mountain pennyroyal. That's one that was really selected by all the bumblebee species for the most part that we encountered. And we can also look at it from the other standpoint. Let's see.
Hey everybody, sorry for the lag. Seems like Zoom kicked Helen out, but we're gonna get her back in and we'll be able to pick up exactly where we ended. There she is.
Okay, I hope that like the computer didn't shut down 30 minutes ago. It was recent.
Very recent. Yes, it was very recent. Don't worry about it.
I was almost done.
Welcome back.
Sorry, people. I think I was basically done. I was just talking on the slide. I think I was really just talking about plant selection and how on this part of the graph you can see which plant species are being selected by which bumblebees, and that how it varies over the time of year by species, but that all of these species are important and being selected for by bumblebees. So I'm just going to hope that that's where I was and go on. So really the conclusion of this stuff is that willow cover was driving the riparian bird abundance while floral diversity was driving the bumblebee abundance. We can't meet all needs of all taxa, in one sort of hectare area, but that we need to, do need to manage for heterogeneity at sort of a stream reach or riparian corridor scale. And that creating conditions that favor willow recruitment and floral resources of staggered bloom periods are going to be important. And also we should be trying to think about using bumblebee favored plants in some of our seed mixes when we're, especially with like fire restoration, where seed mixes are often part of the process. And I guess just really what's next on all of this stuff with IBP and with our partners at the Sierra Meadows Partnership is trying to continue with hydrologic restoration in an effort to support both at-risk species and providing, that connectivity, but also climate refugia, potentially some of the more common species as we see changes in climate patterns. We do think it's important to try to restore multiple meadows within a system so that we have a network of high quality habitat within dispersal distance for a lot of the birds that we're looking at. And then again, just not forgetting plants as part of meadow restoration. If we can take it beyond just the hydrology and really do what we can to both collect seeds, propagate seeds, plant out willows, and then use techniques like hot wire exclosures or pasture rotation, or making sure that we have rest from livestock grazing, at least in the period, post restoration, that those are the things that are going to really take restoration to the next level, where we're really trying to make sure that the plant communities we're trying to grow, so that they're there for the birds and the bumblebees and all the other taxa, have a real chance after restoration of the hydrology. And just there's more still coming in terms of looking at nesting success, and we have some projects that are getting ready to go to restoration, that where we have been collecting a lot of bumblebee baselines. So we'll be able to start looking at some of that actual response to restoration with bumblebees. And I think I just have on here a number of papers that we talked about, that I talked about today, that are available out there. Too many people to thank in terms of all of the different field crews and partners, but yeah, that's it. I think that's it.
All right, thank you so much. We do have some questions in the pane, so I will pull up these questions and ask them.
Okay.
One from John Dunn. He asks if the restoration involves regulating livestock, like cattle and mules. Presumably they'd increase the incidence of brood parasitism for some species, and probably including the willow flycatcher, if the impacts would be on them. What do you think?
Yeah, so that's a great point. And that was kind of one of those bullets at the end. I think that's a really important thing, that we make sure that we're managing all of these land uses, especially, post restoration. And I think it's really varied. Some of the projects I've worked with, especially say the example I showed with willow flycatchers in the Parazo Meadows system, when they started the processes that the Forest Service did to undergo that project, at the same time they reworked their grazing allotment management plan as part of that same kind of integrated with the restoration plan, so that they created this pasture rotation system in there, so that this parts of that livestock allotment that had the willow flycatchers breeding only were grazed every other year, and only after the breeding season ended. And so, whereas other pastures within that allotment that didn't have breeding flycatchers up on some of the slopes or some of the drier meadow systems, those areas also had some rest as well mixed in, but they didn't have some of the timing issues. They weren't livestock weren't excluded earlier in the season. So I think that's really been successful up there. If just looking at the vegetation too, it wasn't really something we could tease apart very well in our project from the rest of the restoration, but I'm sure it has a positive effect. And I think that most restoration projects do try to incorporate rest from grazing for a year or two after major construction in these systems, but I wouldn't say that that's necessarily the rule. It's something that I think most of the time happens, but I think we could take we could look at it more closely too, and try to maybe build in some pastures and rotation options that are a little bit more long-term, could probably be beneficial.
Lena Hayashi asks, are the restored meadows in the Sierra accessible to the public, and would citizen science using eBird aid in providing data of bird populations?
Yeah, I mean, almost all of these are. There's a few exceptions where some of these are on private lands that are kind of more closed private lands. Some of them are on private lands that are sort of within the inner, mixed within the Forest Service matrix, and are also available. But I'd say that the majority of them probably are accessible. I think that that's a good point. That's something that we could be looking at now, especially some of them, like there's areas with restoration that has occurred around Lake Tahoe, or some of the areas where we really do have a lot of people and a lot of people birding, and that focusing on looking closer maybe at some of the eBird data there, or encouraging that kind of citizen or community science within some of these systems could have a benefit. I could see that, because it's true that that finding money for monitoring is definitely one of the the challenges to long term after construction's happened. There's not a real obvious funding source for that long-term monitoring, so it'd be good.
Right. John Dunn asks, while we're on bumblebees, what about yellow-legged frogs?
Yeah, I mean, yellow-legged frogs are also in the mix here. Many of these sites also have yellow-legged frogs. It's not something that I've looked at. So like in terms of being able to speak very intelligently about them, I'm kind of limited, but I do know, that some of those same things we think about, like vegetation that's providing, overhanging vegetation to provide cover, aquatic invertebrates, all of those things that benefit some of our bird populations are going to have, I would think, in most cases, some kind of benefit for yellow-legged frogs. But there's also going to be some things where I'm sure they don't, mesh very well. And again, that's kind of coming back to, looking for ways to manage for multiple target species in an area.
Lily asks, did you factor in issues like invasive plants?
We didn't. Well, we didn't really factor it in. We definitely did keep track, like I say, of plants. So that Sersium arvens that the bumblebees were using on the moonlight fire is an invasive plant. We did see other, at least exotic, if not invasive plants being used, things like bull thistle. I certainly wouldn't recommend, using any of those in a seed mix for bumblebees or for restoration at all. But I think it's telling, I guess, that we can use it as an opportunity to look at what other native plant might meet that need within that niche of, blooming at that time. That's sort of a flower, and some of the native thistle and things like that. So I think there's definitely room to look at that. And we are keeping track of it for the bumblebee work. Not as much for the bird stuff, and most of our projects being at the elevations they are, we don't have things like as much in terms of like tamarisk or arundo grass or some of the things that you might be seeing in riparian areas at lower elevations or further south.
I've got just a few more questions in here.
Okay.
Here's a fun one from Barbara Peck. Is the bumblebee flower slide something that can be shared? I find that one very interesting.
Yes, absolutely. Leave me more descriptive of which one you mean, I guess maybe in the chat, and I'll look at it and see, but I can share, all the stuff is stuff I can share.
Okay. Robin asks, did you do any studies in, and I'm going to slaughter this name, Tulumna Meadows?
I think, are you talking about, yeah, I did not, but that is one of the study sites that our partners at Point Blue are studying. So that's in the mix of this. And in that first paper that I presented some of the results where we're continuing to do monitoring so that we can do this before after impact. So yeah, that's not one that I worked in, but yeah, since we do partner with other, research groups, we're kind of trying to incorporate all of those together. And that's a great site though.
And then I've got one last question from Liga. Can you address the importance of periodic catastrophic events such as flood and fires on meadow species diversity? You have data on changes in frequency of such events.
Yeah, those are of course important. I mean, floods have always been part of these systems, and so is fire, I'm sure. And to what degree, will depend a lot on how wet is a meadow and what time of year a fire would move through and how the intensity of the fire, just like all other fire-related things. It's very complicated, but I'm sure it's very important for these systems. I know that there's a researcher with the Forest Service Pacific Southwest Research Station who is just actually getting underway, trying to look at meadow restoration and within areas that have had recent wildfires. So I know it's on the radar and that people are looking at that. And then I like to think too, in terms of some of those disturbance things too, that's also a little bit how we think of beaver in a way too, because they are also creating a disturbance within these landscapes. They create flooding. Sometimes they go through and they chop down all the willow in a place where maybe, you might not be super happy about it if you were monitoring a bird nest there, but they are creating that kind of disturbance that regenerates a lot of the vegetation. Yeah, I mean, disturbance is definitely part of it. I guess I can't speak to that in terms of data that I could provide.
All right, thank you. That's the last of the questions.
All right, yay. Sorry that took so long.
Oh, not at all. Take it away, John.
Well, thank you, Ellen. That was a great presentation. I just want to share with everybody that during the last break, there was a willow flycatcher in my yard, a passing migrant, no doubt, and maybe it was a harbinger of your excellent presentation. So I hope you'll all join me in giving Helen a virtual ovation.